I'm going to show you how to make REST API calls to Aria Automation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
This is part 9 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In parts 1 through 8, we took a generic look at how to make REST API calls. But now, in parts 9 and onwards, we're going to take a look at specific VMware products. In part 9, we're going to be taking a look at how to make REST API calls to VMware Aria Automation. The first thing I do whenever I'm automating something new is I go look for the API documentation. As you can see on this slide, I'm showing you 3 different pieces of documentation that I recommend that you take a look at. So let's head over to the lab environment and take a quick look. As I said a few moments ago, let's take a quick look at the API documentation. The first URL that I showed you in that slide a moment ago is developer.vmware.com/APIs. This website contains API documentation for loads and loads and loads of different VMware products. As you go to this page, you, if you're like me, are going to immediately see this section here that says Automation API, and you're going to jump in there and think that it's Aria Automation API documentation, but that's not. If you read real closely here, this is vSphere Automation API documentation, not what we're looking for. It's a great API. It's a REST API for vSphere, but that's not what we're looking for. So let's scroll down a bit here. And as you can see, there are loads of links here for different APIs for different VMware products. And one thing that makes the API documentation for Aria Automation a bit different is the fact that it has multiple APIs. Now, collectively, I talk about Aria Automation as if it had a single API, but as you can see here, it has loads of different APIs. There's the vRealize Automation ABX API. There's the vRealize Automation Advanced Designer Service API, and so forth. There's link after link after link here, and part of what you're going to be doing is looking through these different sections to find the REST operations that you want to call. All right, so we will be looking in different parts of this API documentation. We're not going to look in these. We're not going to look in these. We're going to look at these ones that say vRealize Automation something or another. For example, the vRealize Automation Blueprint API could come in real handy, or the Deployment API. You might want to hit pause, go to this URL, and take a look at all the entries here in this middle column that begin vRealize Automation something API, because that's where you're going to find out about all the REST operations. The next URL that I'd like to take you to is this one that goes to blogs.vmware.com. As you can see, back in February of 2021, so as the time of this recording, that was 2.5 years ago, my colleague Kristina posted an excellent explanation in this blog about how to authenticate to vRealize Automation. And it remains, this many years later, still an excellent description of what you're going to need to do. Now, in the next video, part 9b, I'm going to show you how to authenticate. But after you go through that video, I would still recommend you come back and take a look at Kristina's article to fill in some of the gaps. The next documentation that I'd like to show you is from the official product documentation. So there's this section here titled, What are the VMware Aria Automation APIs and how do I use them? Plus all the sub-articles here will provide you an excellent, very flushed out explanation of how to use the Aria Automation API. Now again, in part 9 videos, I'm going to be showing you lots of different things, but you can go into even more detail by reading through these. Now I happen to be showing you in this screen documentation from Aria Automation 8.12, which as of the date of this recording is not the latest version of Aria Automation. As of today, the latest version of Aria Automation is 8.13. Now we have the same documentation for that version, and I've taken the opportunity here to actually preload that here. The document that you see here contains all the same information from that page that I just showed you, but in this case here, I'm looking at it as a PDF. And as you look at the PDF, if we jump into the table of contents, section number 2 is hugely important. If you don't know how to authenticate, you're not going to be able to do much of anything with the Aria Automation API. So that would be a great section to read. Again, in part 9b of this video series, I'm going to show you how to authenticate, but you still would do well to take a look at this section. Then they show you some use cases. Then they show you how to do all sorts of things. There's tons of useful information in here. So let's hop on over into Postman and start doing some real stuff. All right, so here we are in Postman. And if you look at the screen here, you'll notice that I don't actually have any REST requests defined yet. Now, if we wanted to, we could manually create all these REST requests, but that would make this video super long. I would make mistakes. You would get frustrated. I wouldn't blame you. So what I've done is I've already defined the REST requests. I've created a collection of these REST requests that you can download from my GitLab repository. And in fact, I'm going to do that myself right now. Let's go over to our web browser. And as you can see, I've already preloaded here gitlab.com/brianwatrous/VVork, VVork. And in here, there is a folder called YouTube. In the YouTube folder, there's a folder called Making REST API Calls. And in here, there is a folder called Collections. Let's go there. And what we want to do is download this collection called VRA8 Postman_collection.json. To do so, we're going to click on the name. I know you want to come up here and click on this download button, but if you do that, that's going to download all these. Maybe you want to do that, but if you just want to download the one, click on the name of the one. That'll take you to this page. So here's the JSON code for this collection. You can read through it if you want, but we just need to download it. So we'll click on download, and then you can download it someplace like your downloads folder. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And since I happen to be in here, I'm also going to go, go up a couple folders back to Making REST API Calls. I'm also going to download an environment that I've predefined. So if you click on environments, the environment is called VVork.postman environment.json. So click its name, and again, just download that environment file. We'll find out in a short little bit here why you need that environment file. All right, so we've got the stuff that we need from GitLab. Let's go back to Postman and let's import the goodies that we just downloaded. So to do so, we can go to Import, select us some files, and I suppose you could do these both at the same time, but I'm going to do them one at a time. Let's go take a look at the REST request that I've defined here in this folder called About. This request is defined to go to the endpoint ias/api/about. Now I know about that endpoint URL because I've read through the API documentation. In that API documentation, it told me that what this operation is going to do is it's going to inform me all of the different versions, all the different API versions that my Aria Automation server supports. That's right. A single Aria Automation server can support multiple versions of the API. So by calling this REST request, we're going to get that information. So let's go ahead and click the send button and see what happens. Actually, if you want to hit pause, I know that this is going to fail. You might want to take a look at the screen and see if you can figure out why this is going to fail. But let's go ahead and click send and see what happens. When I click send, you'll notice that we get an error message down below, which is somewhat cryptically informing us that Postman doesn't know about this variable called VRA_server. So you notice here in the URL, it says VRA_server, but it's got this pinkish highlighting behind it. That's the way, that highlighting is the way that Postman informs you, I don't know this variable that you're talking about. In these REST requests, in this collection that I'm going to be showing you, I'm going to be working with a VRA server called SA-VRA-01. Postman doesn't know the name of that server. Postman doesn't have this variable defined until I define it. And not only do I need to define this variable, there's a whole bunch more variables that I need to define. Rather than do these from scratch, what I've done is I've previously created all the variables. I've previously set them with all the values that I want, and I exported them to a JSON file. Now, you saw me a few moments ago actually download that JSON file. So what I'm going to do is import that JSON file. So let's do that by clicking Import. We'll choose Files. And a few moments ago, we imported the collection, but now we're going to import the environment because this environment contains all the variables that we're going to be working with. So I'll select the environment file. I'll click Open. And now I have a new environment. If you go to Environments, the new environment is called VVork. So if we select that environment, I've selected the VVork environment, you can see I've defined all these different variables. Now the first 5 of them, you'll notice that I've already plugged in some values, but these values are appropriate for my environment. I have a VRA server called sa-VRA-01.vclass.local. Your VRA server or your Aria Automation server probably has a different FQDN. Same thing for your orchestrator server, same thing for what account you're going to authenticate as, same thing for the password. These values are appropriate in my environment. You're going to need to change these to suit your environment. Now you'll notice we have a whole bunch of other variables such as VRA underscore API underscore version and API underscore token. And these, I have not preset any values because we're going to set the values for these programmatically. So you just need to focus on these first 5 variables. Why don't you hit pause and take a few moments to plug in values appropriate for your environment. All right, I'm going to go back to collections. And as you'll recall, we've got this collection called Get API Info. And you'll notice that we still see the pink highlighting. And if we hover here, it still says, I don't know what this variable is. The reason is, even though we have successfully imported the environment with all of its variables, we have not selected that environment. So make certain that you go up here to this drop-down list and choose the VVork environment. And now you'll notice that the pink highlighting goes away. This is what a properly variable should look like. And if you hover on the variable, you can see what the initial value is, what the current value is, and what its scope is. So if you don't know about variables and scopes, that was in an earlier video. All right. Whereas a few moments ago, when we click Send, it failed. Let's see what happens when we click Send now. Hey. I got back a status code 200. You know what that means. And we can see the information that got returned. All right, if you want to, you can hit pause and look at this JSON data up close and in detail, but I'm going to give you a quick version of this. Looking in this JSON data that was returned in the response body, I can see that my Aria Automation server supports 2 different API versions. It supports the older 2019 January 15th version of the API and the newer 2021 July 15 version of the API. Now, in my demo environment here, I'm actually running Aria Automation 8.10. So you don't see any newer versions of the API than this, and that's actually fine. In your lab environment, you may very well see different API versions in addition to the ones that you see here. So what's the point of these API versions? The point of the API versions is to enable you, the developer of a REST client, to be able to know with certainty how the API is going to behave so that your REST client continues to work even if VMware introduces new API versions. When you create your REST client, or in our case, we're just using Postman, you can lock our API down to a specific version. And then even if VMware updates to add newer versions, your REST client will continue to behave the way it had previously. Now, you'll notice in this particular case here, it mentions the word deprecated. That older 2019 version of the API is officially deprecated. Deprecated is a fancy word that means you can use this version, but when we say it's deprecated, that means we have plans to remove this version. So think of deprecation as being our tip-off to you that, hey, if you're using this old version, you're going to want to update your REST client. But let's not worry about deprecation right now. The third thing that you see down here on the bottom is it will always tell you the latest version of the API that this Aria Automation server supports. All right, there you have it. That was pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at our next REST request. Now, if you look at the URL, this REST request is doing essentially the same thing as the previous REST request, but what I've done here is I've added some JavaScript code to the test tab. Now, as a reminder, the test tab can be used to write JavaScript code to test to see whether things are working, but the test tab can be used for more general purpose. So there's the pre-request script, which is obviously JavaScript code that gets called before your request gets called. And even though it's not called this, I think of the test tab as being the post-request script tab. So the code that you see me writing here isn't actually a test. Instead, what it's doing, crucially here in line number 3, is it is setting a variable. This is my variable called VRA_API_version. What this is going to do is let's actually go ahead and send the request. When I send this request and I get back this response body, this code is going into the data here in the response body, and it's looking for this piece of information, specifically its value. So that's what data.latestAPI version means. It means go get this value that you see right here. And we're going to store that value in a variable called VRA_API_version. Again, that's my variable. Let's go back to our VVork environment and see the value of the variable called VRA_API_version. Whereas before, VRA_API_version was blank for both its initial value and its current value, it's now got a value. And we can use this variable in all of our subsequent REST requests that we make. We can pass in that variable to explicitly instruct VRA or Aria Automation exactly which version of the API that we want to use. Now, just to give you a quick little glimpse into how this versioning stuff's going to work with this new variable that I've set up, if we go over to, let's just go pick another request here. I could pick any of the requests in any of these other folders, but if I go look at this request, you'll notice at the tail end of this operation URL, it says and API version equals, and then it's setting that equal to my variable. So whether I call this REST request or this request or any of these REST requests, I keep passing in that variable that we just programmatically set. It gets passed into the API using the API's variable called API_version, but this is all it takes to lock down your REST client so that it talks to a specific version of the REST API. Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking at the Aria Automation API.